soon joining us.
Excellent.
Hi, Eva. Hi, Veronica.
Hello. Sorry for being with my camera off, but I went running early in the morning and then have been in meetings throughout the morning, so I'm ashamed to show myself.
It's okay. It's okay. Do not worry. Linda Kim, welcome to this session. Oh, Eric is here.
Good morning, we have to say to him.
Hello, Eric.
Very, very good afternoon and morning and evening.
Good morning.
Hi.
I'll wake you up, Eric.
It's 1 o'clock at my end, so yeah.
Nice to see you, Eric.
Nice to see you, everybody, too. Yes. Hello, Maureen.
So what do you think, Ursula? Shall we just start or?
Yes,
Okay.
I think so. You can introduce the network, Liv.
Yeah, okay. Welcome to this event, Engage with Ideas, arranged by the Design Literacy International Network. My name is Liv Merete Nielsen from Oslo Metropolitan University, Norway. Today, we have invited Maureen Carroll to present her ideas. So a warm welcome to you, Maureen. And we're very much looking forward to your presentation titled Becoming, What Does It Mean to Be an Education Designer? Just a few words about the network. Design literacy builds upon the idea that design is not a matter for professional designers alone. We're building upon the ideas of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's writings and practice in the 1970s, and we have added design to his concept of literacy. Just as we now meet other fields of knowledge doing the same, we have health literacy, economic literacy, eco-literacy, where the study of the knowledge base and practice, both for professionals and for the general public, is central. Objectives and content must be seen in context, both in society and in education. So, in order to move in direction of a greener and better tomorrow, designers and the general public, in their position as politicians, consumers, users, and clients, needs to be involved, skilled, and critical in order to accomplish real cooperation. This is of increased importance for democratic participation, diversity, and equity in society. Today is our 17th event in this network, and through the 16 events we have had until now, we have seen different perspectives and inputs which have contributed to our reflections, both in theory and practice, and we are happy for that. So now, my co-chair Ursula Brau will give a short introduction to Maureen's work, and Erik Bohemia will later chair the following discussion. So please, Ursula, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Liv. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Ursula Bravo from Universidad del Desarrollo in Chile. I would like to acknowledge the Communication and Research Department of the School of Design to disseminate and translate this talk. And of course, thank you so much, Maureen, for accepting our invitation. I met Maureen Carroll in 2016 at the D School of Stanford University. At this time, I was working with Catalina Cortés, Peter Lloyd, and Derek Jones on a project to transfer design tools to Chilean teachers. Even if Peter and Derek had created the design thinking course for the Open University in the UK, Catalina and I wanted to know about other models developed specifically for school contexts. At Stanford, we observed an after-school program in Palo Alto, and we attended a masterclass taught by Maureen Carroll and Shelley Goldman. Both experiences were very inspiring for us and our project. Some years later, when organizing the talk series focused on design literacy together with Liv Merete and Eric Bohemia, I thought Maureen Carroll would be a key guest. Maureen Carroll is a founder of Lime Design. She has been teaching at the D School of Stanford for over a decade. She was the director of Red Lab, which explores the intersection of design and learning. She was also a lecturer in Stanford University Graduate School of Education, where she co-taught educating youth STEM thinkers. Maureen is currently working on the research project that combines machine learning and qualitative research methods to understand more about the transformation that happens during students' these school learning journeys. Maureen, welcome again. From now, you have full control of the session and you can share your screen.
Thank you, Ursula. Thank you for your welcome. So my very first teaching job, I was frankly a little bit terrified of the little students that I was teaching. I remember every day they were third graders, 8 years old, and they were just full of energy. And I remember as the buses would load, unload, and you would hear the rising din of children rushing into the school, I remember being really afraid because I wasn't sure if I could get them to sit still long enough to have them learn all that I was hoping to teach them. That changed. Like, I was really concerned about really wanting to make sure that I was in control and I could really be in charge of the classroom. That changed one day. We had had a very, very cold New England winter, and the kids were all in reading groups. And one student, as we switched from group to group, ran to the window and he said, Mrs. Carroll, look, look. And we looked out the window and this is what we saw. It was the first daffodil of spring. And in that moment, I feel like I really became a teacher because I let go of the reading structure and we all gathered around the window and suddenly we were talking about snow melting and flowers growing and seasons changing. And everything really changed for me in that moment. And I think about the same thing happens in the world of research. You have a plan, you have a structure, but really what's most important is listening to the children's voices and being responsive and watching what happens in those moments. And I think that not only shaped me as a teacher, but as a lifelong learner. When Ursula and Liv and Eric invited me to do this talk, I thought about the idea of a fermata. A fermata is an articulation mark in music that allows a note or a chord to be held for as long as desired. And it's that those moments where sometimes we're just quickly rushing through and doing what we have to do. And we don't take that pause. We don't hold that note. A lot of times we're just in step and moving forward. So this was an opportunity for me to hold that note for a minute and think about what does it mean to become an education designer and what does that look like? My research journey began when I really think I began to understand what it was like to be a qualitative researcher, where I got my doctorate at the University of California at Berkeley. And my doctorate is in language, literacy, and culture. You may notice on the side of the screen, there are piles of laundry. That's kind of what my life was like. I have 3 sons. My husband was traveling internationally during the 6 years where I was trying to get this done. My youngest was in kindergarten. My oldest was in 4th grade at the time. And I think we had a current theme of there was laundry everywhere because there was never enough time to do everything that we had to get done in order to finish the work that I was doing. And I think about who shaped that journey. And I think about Anne Haas Dyson. Anne taught me more than anybody about the heart of what it was like to be a qualitative researcher. Her work with children and her ability to listen to what was happening in the social interactions among the children gave me a real concrete, grounded understanding of what social constructivism it was, what these theoretical concepts of Bakhtin and Vygotsky were, but they became very real in Anne's work and what she taught me about being a qualitative researcher. The other influence that really shaped me as a researcher was Sarah Friedman. Sarah taught me how to not only document what was happening, but see what was I documenting. If I said, oh, that student was surprised, she would push me to say, how did you know that? Were the child's eyebrows raised? Did their voice go up in pitch? She taught me how to make sure that what I was seeing, I was actually documenting and being able to not only document it, but notice. And I think that same idea that echoed through about listening to children's voices was part of really being aware of what was happening and getting out of myself and seeing what were the children doing. And my dissertation was on technology and early literacy. So we had a screen and then we had students at the screen. So that ability to really pay attention and be able to collect my data, both of those women really shaped how I saw that. And I remember that lovely feeling when I started my doctorate work and I thought, when I'm finished, hooray, I will know everything. And instead, I found out I don't know everything because there's too much to know. And that first dissertation was only a beginning step in the journey. And I think that really helped me remember why it's so important to be a lifelong learner and how, as a researcher, you're always curious, you're always learning, you always want to find out what's next. That journey took me to Stanford. I had done research on literacy and critical thinking. And what I found is at the D School, the work of a designer, there was much of intersection between how design was conceived of and how literacy and critical thinking skills and how they came together. David Kelly was a strong advocate of education. I remember when we wanted to start Lime Design, David was the first person to say, go out and teach design to the world and be an educator. He felt that was really, really an important part of being a designer, was getting out in the world and teaching and working with students and with teachers. When we think about defining design, we think of it as a human-centered, prototype-driven process. That's kind of the key definition of what design thinking is. And one important nuance of that is the idea that students are not just problem solvers. We're not training people to go from point A to point B. We want them to be problem finders. And being a problem finder demands a sense of agency. We have to go out and find the problems that are worth solving. And being able to teach students that, the importance of that, is something that I think every design educator is aware of. Because ultimately, what you want to do is build the idea of creative confidence. We all think that we're all artists when we're in kindergarten, and suddenly that sort of disappears, the idea that creativity only belongs to the creatives. And one of the most important things that David Kelly talks about is everybody is creative. And it's our job to make sure that people have confidence in their creative ability. My nephew, Chris, was visiting me in California. Chris was 8 years old, and we went to a video arcade where they had a claw machine. A claw machine is a game where you put your money in the slot and a big hand-shaped claw comes down to get your prize and grab the prize and take it out, and you won. But for Chris, he wasn't winning and he wasn't happy. So he decided he was going to do something and build his own claw machine.
How are you building something when you're not really sure what it's going to be? Well, I wasn't really, at first I wasn't sure, but then I found out how, last night I found out how fun the game was, so I just decided to make a claw machine. Even though it's really hard, I'm going to try to make this one easy. What will you do if the first one doesn't work? I'll just try it a different way until it works.
How will you know what to do?
Well, I just won't do the same thing because, like, if I do the same thing, I know it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. And how will you get ideas to do something different?
Well, I'm not really sure. My guess it'll just pop into my head.
And that idea that'll just pop into my head is something that everyone has when they're this big, but something that we lose. And the idea of creative confidence, we want to have Chris's creative confidence in believing that ideas will just pop into our head.
How are you building something when you're...
So when we began the research journey at Stanford, what we wanted to know is we had this process that had these hexagons and these steps, but we wanted to know, what does that look like in classrooms? And the classrooms we were at were the after school program that Ursula and Catalina were able to visit with us, because we were really curious about, we knew this process existed, but what was really happening when teachers and students embraced the process in the classroom? And this is kind of what it felt like. No one had really done this research before. It felt like a lot of mosaic pieces. We weren't quite sure how they would come together, what patterns they would form. It was sort of uncharted ground. And that led us to our first research. This was the first paper that we wrote about design, and the first time that we really were able to get an idea about what this looked like. We had some questions. We wanted to know, how did the students express their understanding of design thinking in the classroom activities they were doing? And then we were really curious about the affective elements. What were the emotions surrounding the implementation of design in the classroom environment? And then from the teacher's perspective, she was really curious about how is she going to connect this new approach to the academic standards she had to teach and the content learning she was involved with in the classroom. So this class was 11 and 12-year-olds, and it was a geography class. So what the students did was they studied the concept of systems in geography. And then when they integrated design, they took on design challenges by exploring systems that existed in their own school space. So they took a look at things like, what did the cafeteria look like? They were all very, very interested in redesigning the cafeteria because that was really an important social space for them. And there was lots of things wrong that they wanted to change. They were thinking of ideas like building a stage so that they could do performances during this lunch break. And they looked at things like car safety. The school was in a area where there wasn't a lot of space for students to be dropped off at school. So they're really concerned about things like the parking lot flow and car safety and recycling. So they were trying to make this intersection between systems and this new design thinking process that they were learning. And this is what we learned from that. We came up with this theme of design as exploring. And what happened is, because the students were very used to being taught from, this is how you go from point A, this is where you get to point B, they hadn't had the opportunities to experiment and iterate. So when they came up with an idea, say, for example, in the school cafeteria, they got a chance to prototype it and try it and find out that, you know what, that wasn't in the right place, or the stage wasn't high enough, or none of the students really liked the idea. So they got an opportunity to see that they could sort of embody that growth mindset. They could keep thinking about, what can I learn by experimenting and by iterating. The other thing was kind of something that was unexpected for us, is the idea that you really have to collaborate in a very meaningful way when you're in a design challenge. It's not an individual task. And that happens all throughout the process, from what you're deciding the problem is, like being problem finders. We sent the students out in teams of 5, and they were looking for what were the systems in their school that weren't working. And then being able to brainstorm together. They had to build prototypes together. They had to figure out how to test things. So the idea of them really coming together as collaborators, the design process gave them an opportunity to do that. And then this was an interesting finding too, because the teachers, although excited about becoming design thinkers, they had a lot to teach, and they were trying to figure out how content learning could merge with design. Framing things as design challenges sort of forefronted the content area learning, like we had to know about systems before we could engage in this design challenge. Much of the way design is taught is framed around design challenges. And even to this day, it's not as easy to do. Sometimes teachers will take a part of the design process, maybe teach their students how to do interviewing by using content, maybe in social studies or science, and then figure out how does that fit within the arc of a design challenge. Other times they'll just, let's brainstorm alternative endings to a story. So there's lots of pieces and ways to do that, but it's not, it is a new approach to learning. And in this study and what I've seen in the field, it's not always the easiest thing to do. One of my favorite things that we learned about this, and this kind of echoes back to what Chris, my nephew, said, is the idea that instruction, right? As children are moving along the education journey, instruction is moving from stories where they start out and everything is a story. We're learning lots of narrative and narrative discourse in the early grades. And then suddenly we're moving to facts and we're moving away from speculation and openness into this is what we're learning. And the imagination piece fades from focus. And I think what happens, and I've seen happen with design, is that it kind of reawakens that possibility and that openness to imagination. As we were walking out the door, one of the students said, I really liked using my imagination. I haven't used it for a long time. This is a student who's 11 years old. And that was a joyful thing to hear, that he had used it, and also a little bit concerning that he hadn't used it in a while. And that brought me to another pause moment. We were, because of what we had learned about the teacher and the struggles, we thought about how could we learn more about this integration piece. So we formed Red Lab. Red Lab was with Shelley Goldman, who Ursula met as well. We decided, how could we do research on the impact of design on learning? And we received a National Science Foundation grant to study this. And our grant was about the intersection of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and design. And how could they go together? And what would this look like? We had our grad students who were very, very skilled. They're all master's or doctoral students in the science, technology, engineering, or math fields. And they were new to design thinking. And what we did is we brought them, we started a class for them to learn design thinking, and then an after-school program where they were going to bring what they learned, all their expertise in their fields, and this new approach of design thinking to middle schoolers in an after-school program. And this was a new thing for them because they were only used to being experts, and all of a sudden they were learning this new thing, and then they immediately had to teach it. And if any of you have worked with middle school students, if it's not working, you know right on very quickly what works and what doesn't work. And that's what our students learned. And once after the quarter of them working with the middle schoolers, then we created a curriculum with these are the activities that worked. And this is how you integrate STEM and design thinking. What we learned, our data source was we had our students, the grad students, keep journals. And that was our data source for this research project. And we learned a lot about how empathy is a two-way street. I would have to say that we probably learned as much from the students, the middle school students, and the grad students as they learned from us, which was a really kind of a nuanced thing, but an important thing to think about is that we're not really giving empathy. Empathy is a transaction between learners. One of the students, this was part of his journal, he said a lecturer talks at an audience, a teacher engages with an audience, but is the predominant talker in the conversation, and a mentor engages with the mentee and is equally a talker and a listener. And this wasn't something that this student came into this program with. This is something that he learned through the interactions with the students. What was a mentor? That wasn't a very well-defined thing. And how cool and accessible can I be, yet I'm also in charge of this small group of students. So that negotiation was an important part of our students' learning and also impacted the middle school students as well. And the idea, I think, that really permeated the program was the idea that the playing field was level. Everyone was new to design, and our Stanford students were used to being experts. They were experts in their STEM fields. So for them to be vulnerable and realize that they didn't know how to do this, so they discovered a lot about themselves as learners, and I think they were able to model that for the middle schoolers and really see what that's like. That prototyping mindset led to this quote, "We may not know the answer, but we can work together to figure it out." The student who wrote this, she was not really comfortable with the idea of not knowing something when they started. When you're designing an activity, maybe looking at volume and water, and they have balloons and things are kind of chaotic and they don't really know what would work or what would happen. Being able to be vulnerable and understand that, tell the students, we don't know how to do this, but we are going to figure that out, was building that capacity as designers and resilient thinkers to be like, okay, let's do this together. We're collaborating, we're seeing mentorship, we're seeing learning, we're seeing vulnerability. And that part of the research journey, I think, is really important and kind of frames what it is to be a designer. This idea, again, permeated through design. Design thinking puts ownership of the problem into the learner's hands. So that happened with the grad students because we didn't really tell them, we didn't really know how to teach design to middle schoolers. That was their responsibility. And also the grad students gave that same challenge to the middle schoolers. Okay, how are we going to figure this out? How are we going to solve this problem? So with all of it, the learning continued. And this idea of enjoying how the design process helps students to negotiate their strengths, weaknesses, and places of uncertainty. I would say that comment was true for the students, the middle school students, but it was also true for our grad students, that idea of how will we figure this out? How will we navigate these ambiguous spaces that we don't always know how to deal with? We paused again. One thing that stood out to me was this idea. I had the opportunity with Lime Design to be out in the field and working with teachers and students. We were constantly experimenting with experiential workshops to help students learn to be designers. And what stuck out was the idea that in design, we can't just talk about it. We have to experience it. We have to, when we're in a workshop, we have to viscerally understand what this process looks like in order to own it, in order to teach it to others. And that was a goal that permeated the work that we did in the field with teachers and with students. And the idea of becoming kind of echoed through that. And I remember when reading Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, the idea that it's not about arriving somewhere or achieving a certain aim. I see it instead as a forward motion, a means of evolving, a way to teach continuously toward a better self. The journey doesn't end. And that idea as a researcher is really important. We're not done. We're never done. We're always curious. What else can we learn? And for me, being able to have this opportunity where I was in academia and learning about design and constantly pushing the envelope, and then out in the field with real teachers and real students and seeing, what does this look like? What is this? How does this work? What's the best way to teach students and teachers how to become designers? And I knew that while doing this workshop, there sort of must be more than just this process. And what I learned was that there were mindsets that I was calling, like I would run a one-day workshop where we would do a design challenge, we would learn the design process. But the second day was all about how can we practice the mindsets that are really part of being a designer? What we did is activities like I teach, we learn. This was inspired by Louise Moll's work on funds of knowledge, where we asked the teachers in the workshop to come up with something that they could teach in 5 minutes to someone else. So Maybe some people taught jump roping. Some people taught how might you knit, or how might you hold a guitar chord and change between a C and a G chord. After you figured out what it was, you taught it to someone else. And then your goal was to go teach it to another person. So you became teachers and learners, and we became part of this collective fund of knowledge and built community in a way that really acknowledged not only that skill, but acknowledged who we were as people. What were we bringing into the classroom? And I think as a researcher, being aware of who the whole person that you're studying, not just kind of what you hear and see, but really being able to acknowledge that, echoed through as a mindset that's really important as a designer. We also created this activity, and this was an empathy-based activity. One of the things I think is really important is we can't talk about empathy. We have to really feel it in our hearts. This activity we played the Cat Stevens song, Father and Son. And that song is a sort of a duet between a father and a son. The father is trying to impart this wisdom that he's gained over his lifetime of experience, and the son is bristling to get away and pave his own path and not listen to what the father's telling him. So we played the song, we asked the group to split in half, and half the group would take on the perspective of the father, and the other half would take on the perspective of the son. When the song was over, we had each group write a postcard to, if you were in the father group, you would write to the son, and the son group write to the father, and tell them, what did you really want them to know? What was missing? What did they not understand about you? And then we formed them in pairs, in father-son pairs, and they shared their postcards and they read them. And instead of just telling them, empathy is really important, the power of music to evoke these feelings. And of course, whenever you're listening to something, you're bringing a part of yourself. So we had parents, we had feelings about parents, parenthood, being a son, being a daughter, seeing what that was like. And we understood empathy in a different way. And for me, activities like I Teach, We Learn, and Father and Son really embodied the mindsets that allowed us to move past thinking of design as a step-by-step, lockstep process. Carissa Carter, my colleague at the D School, came up with this idea of design abilities. She published an article that was entitled, "Let's Stop Talking About the Design Process." And that same idea of deciding that we can't just conceive of design as something, a recipe where we only can do it one way. And this idea that we think of design thinking process with the hexagons as a single song versus design abilities, which are 8 different notes that allow you to combine things in different ways and have a richer, deeper understanding of what design really is. And Carissa defined design abilities as a set of mindsets and behaviors that emphasize what students are learning and recognize the habits they're developing. This was not something that, again, was set in stone, but this is something, an idea that will help us push further and dig more deeply into what design really is. These are the actual 8 design abilities. And what we did is we went out into the field with these abilities, and we worked with a group of teachers because we wanted to understand, were these, the way these design abilities were presented, were they meaningful in how the teachers were understanding them? And what we learned is that instead of the design ability of learning from others, we saw that it was really important to reframe this as learning from and with others. And in doing that, it allowed us to really think about what the historical context and the constructs of the people you're doing interview and empathy work with, what they were and what characterized them. So we felt there was a sense of movement and change and understanding, like what would this look like when we brought it to teachers and the work that they were doing. We also asked them to translate design abilities into ways that made sense for them. And in doing that, we found out that it's really not step that we reference in the design process. This idea of learning with and from others, it has to permeate the work you do as a designer. It has to really echo and be part of everything you're doing. And I think the idea of mindsets and design abilities allows us to get to that place where we're not thinking of design, thinking as this curriculum with a recipe to follow, but really a culture changer and a way to build creative confidence. Again, we were challenged to think, how could we help people understand this in an experiential way? So in this session, we decided to use watercolor paints. Everyone in the session got a little jar of water, some paintbrushes, and watercolor paper. And what we did is we had them go through an activity where we said, begin painting. And then the next thing was, now experiment with different kinds of paint. Go fast, go slow. Paint two things and then paint something that moves them all together. So as they were going through these different painting exercises, there was no scaffolding, you just had the experience. When they finished 8 painting activities, we tied them back to each of the design abilities. When we said begin painting, that's navigating ambiguity. When we said try different kinds of textures and colors, that was experimenting rapidly. When we said paint 3 separate objects and then fuse them together, that was synthesizing information. So we gave them a very concrete, hands-on way to experience the design abilities before they had the opportunity to maybe front load with information, which sometimes in the classroom, that's what we're doing. A lot of the times, that's how we're teaching instead of having the experience first. I think we think about like John Dewey talking about how we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And that echoes through how we want to teach being designers. So some of that work we captured in the National Council of Teachers of English, have a journal called Voices from the Middle. So we had an article called Where Empathy Meets Learning, What Design Abilities Look Like in the K-12 Classroom. And that's kind of captured what we learned from the experience of going out and trying to see what this looked like. And then we had a second article in that same journal called Headlong Dives or Safe Shores, Navigating Ambiguity in Design-Driven Classrooms. And both these articles were thought pieces where we were able to step back ourselves and reflect on what had we learned and how were this new design abilities, what were they looking like in the field. And then the ultimate ending and kind of what we were hoping for as designers, we want that transformative learning to happen. It happens when we get our students to challenge their own assumptions, when we have them in that state of imagination, envisioning new possibilities, and then they leave our classroom with new mindsets, new knowledge, new skills. And then that's our fermata, and that idea of pausing once again, and what does it mean to become an education designer? To me, that means having humility and always being willing to be a lifelong learner.
Thank you very much, Carol. There was lots of information, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. There's a very first one. Ursula has a question. Would you like to ask your question, Ursula?
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Maureen, for your experience. It's very exciting, I think. And thank you for sharing it with us. And my question is, maybe it's very concrete, but what have been the main barriers you have found at the level of the teachers and schools to incorporate design thinking?
I think Ursula, good question. I think the biggest barrier is the idea that it's this extra thing to do. Like the teachers already feel like there's so much content, they have so much work to do, they have to pay attention to education standards. And how can we give them this new thing? It's almost sometimes conceived of like an art program where I can't do the arts, I have to teach the basics, I have to teach lots of information. So I think the solution to that is to show them how you can integrate design challenges to support content learning. So a lot of the curriculum work and the curriculum we've created helps you do that. What happens, I think the positive side of that is sometimes, like, we'll ask students, particularly in literacy, we'll ask them to read a book, but what is the purpose of why they're reading the book isn't particularly clear. If it's framed as a design challenge, like how might we help this character solve a problem, suddenly they're invested in a different way. They're more engaged in the literature, and there's more of a purpose. Same with writing. I think sometimes who are we writing for? Our audience, for the teacher. But if we're writing as part of a design challenge, it sort of reframes that. So I think the biggest problem is time, but the solution is how to integrate the design process with content to support it, not to be an extra.
Thank you. Linda, you had a questions about the, would you like to come in, please?
Why do you, first of all, I was so excited to meet you. I've never been to the Stanford School, but I have followed it as inspiration my entire life. Why do you suspect that design education is now not mainstream in teacher education in the 21st century, where learning has demonstrably changed in its opportunities to engage imagination?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes back to the same thing, Linda, about the idea that we're thinking of this as an extra. I also think the idea that design abilities, because if you think about all the research you see about what skills are 21st century employers looking for, all those things, perseverance, creativity, critical thinking, resiliency, they're all the things that you learn as a designer. And I think there has been a lot of change in, I think Liv talked about this in the beginning, is that design has begun to permeate many different worlds. And I think it's becoming, before it used to be the designer's own design, right? Now everyone is a designer. And I think teachers, more than anybody, are designers. Yeah.
If you go to other countries and go to bookstores, they have complete sections on design. The US, by and large, does not. It has art books. It has books on architecture. I'm an architect. And, self-help books and all those kind of things. But the kind of massive libraries of design reading is not populating our country yet.
Yeah. I have done a lot of work in Singapore, and that's true there. Like, they have really embraced and made those changes.
Absolutely.
Design has become part of the fabric of society. I don't know the answer to that, but it would be good if it was.
I think well, anyway, that's another discussion. I'm sure there are other questions.
I have a question, Carol, and my question is about talking about this mindset and you develop a mindset. And would you be able to maybe give us some idea how long it takes to develop this sort of mindset? It's like, what is the time frame? What are the kind of like the because you talk about the project, but one would imagine so that the mindset takes time to develop. One would imagine so. It's not like a 1 week or 1 month. Do you have any kind of sense, how long it takes to develop this sort of mindset? And is it something that you have to then practice again and again, or is it something that once you learn, it stays with you?
I think it's both. I think one is, you could have a moment, like an aha moment in empathy. We do an exercise where you listen to someone else's story for 5 minutes and then you tell it as though it was your own. And for a lot of people, having to give that story back and really own the facial expressions, the tone of voice, that moment changes them. So empathy becomes something they really get in a visceral way. Other times, it does take a lot of time. Think about how long does it take to teach a child to be resilient? How many times do they have to fall down and scrape their knee and get up and try again? Some mindsets take longer than others, and I think it really depends on the person and how open they are. But I think the belief that they can be practiced, design abilities, we talk about habits they're forming. So in a class, our Stanford quarter is 10 weeks. So over that course of 10 weeks, you're doing multiple iterations of different abilities and mindsets and having people practice them. So I think it's like maybe like learning to play an instrument. So you might have to know the notes, and then at some point you're composing your own music, but and some people it's a different arc of learning to get there. But I do think the belief that it is something you can practice and grow at is essential to being a designer, and that's why design matters.
And is it something that as you say, some abilities are harder to learn, some are easier to learn.
Yeah.
Now, if so, your projects are 10 weeks long. So, what will be the hardest ability that is hardest to learn in your observation?
Well, one way to get at that, to see, like, to make sure that happens is, like, if you were going to teach the curriculum we design, we learned that over 10 weeks or 12 weeks, I'm not sure exactly how long you can implement it in different ways, but you basically start with a very quick design challenge, and then you practice the skills. You learn how to interview, you become a better brainstormer. Brainstorming is something that if you practice, you can become a much, much better brainstormer. Sometimes we ask people to come up with 8 ideas and it takes a half an hour. Sometimes you can come up with 80 ideas in 5 minutes, right? You can build that skill. And then you, again, teach, once you've taught that skill, like this is how you interview, this is how you brainstorm, this is how you build prototypes, then you embed it in a longer challenge, or maybe over 3 days. And then maybe it's a month-long challenge where you really go deeper. So I think it's part of the instructor's job, and we're constantly iterating our own course each quarter to get better. Like, did we do a good job of teaching that skill or that mindset or that ability? So it's a lot of experimentation to see what works. But I don't think any part of it is any particularly more difficult. The mindset, that the design ability that I think is sort of overarches a lot of them, is navigating ambiguity, because that's a skill that, as Linda mentioned, right, that's what we're looking for, is like, how can you navigate uncertain worlds? And that's a skill that, to be a 21st century thinker, you need to have. So even while you're teaching, this is how you brainstorm, you're really giving them this larger idea of this is how you solve a problem that's messy and complex using design.
Thank you. Lee, if you had a comment, would you like to come in, please?
Thank you. I was just mention this book, Etienne Wenger, Communities of Practice. We use that very much in Norwegian teacher training for design teachers, which is much as what you talked about, Maureen. You're learning in a community of practice. You learn by doing practical work. So we use that. That might be interesting for some of you to read. But I had also a question. This the use of the word, the concept, the design thinking. Do you, Maureen, think that what is the benefit of using design thinking as a term instead of using critical thinking, problem solving? Does it in a way gather more than just critical thinking and problem solving? And what do you think of why this design thinking has become so you might say popular, but many uses it. Is it because design is a kind of buzzword? It's like something that promotes, or what do you think?
I remember when I first came to Stanford, I remember David Kelly teaching us that design thinking was a way to make visible how a designer works. And that was why it was called design thinking, right? He said that's something that is sort of not always transparent. I find myself using the word design more than design thinking, not sure why, like design seems to be permeating. And I know design thinking maybe had become popular, right, over the past 10 or 12 years, right? You kind of hear it a lot. I don't really know the answer to it. I'm not really sure why. Because you could say, right, you know, the conversation is critical thinking part of design? Yes. I don't know that one is more, above the other? I'm not really sure. I have to think about that question. Put that in my fermata.
Brian, would you like to come in, please?
I can't hear you.
Well, Brian,
We can't hear you.
Okay, is that better?
great. Oh, it is much better. Yes, thank you.
Yes, okay. Maureen, I'm really curious to learn more about the painting exercise that you described in association with the 8 design abilities. And I know you were successful or happy doing it at a younger in a younger age group. And I'm wondering, how do you migrate that up to a higher age group or an older age group?
We actually did that with teachers, Brian.
Oh.
For the first time. We've done it with teachers and students in the same room, and we've done it with teachers. We've done it remotely. I've actually never even done it in person. We've done it over the past 2 years. It became a way to make that granular. But I think there was something about the feedback was something about the experiential part of it, like being able to paint something and you don't really, like there's no direction, right? So you're navigating ambiguity throughout this whole process of painting. And the unpacking part, not only did we tie it to a design ability, but we gave them examples of, okay, now how would you use this in the classroom? And then it became really real. It wasn't just this academic exercise. It was like, okay, what is an activity where you navigate ambiguity, or you go from, we asked people, one of the design abilities is moving from concrete to abstract. I'm sorry, from abstract to concrete. So we had someone paint something, a coffee cup, and then paint an abstract of it. And then we think, how does that ability to take different perspectives in an activity in a classroom, what does that look like? So does that answer your question, or what, is there anything that you wanted to know more about of that?
It does. It answers the question. Thank you. Do you have a recording, or have you published anything in association with that exercise?
No, we just have done it at a few conferences and with teacher groups that are interested in doing that. But I'll put that on my list too, to write about that because it was a great way to use the arts and make them real and really use a different way. Because a lot of times all we do is talk and write about design, but this was a different way, using a different modality that I think really resonated with teachers and students.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Brian, would you like to bring in like a context for a question?
Context for the question.
Yeah.
Well, it sounded like something really useful that I could use in my current classrooms with my current students. Like, here are the design abilities that we're trying to teach you, and to frame it up as 8. Here are the 8 things that we're trying to help you understand. And here's an exercise to help you define those 8 things.
Yeah.
And they could do it with a pencil and paper right in front of them.
Yeah. And I think, Brian, the key would be to give them the design abilities last, right? Give them the experience first, and then sort of name them, which is, yeah, I think that part matters. Yeah.
I think I could use it. I teach a multidisciplinary innovation course. I think this would be a great exercise to do at the beginning of the semester with them.
If you email me, I'll share the slide deck that we use with you.
I will do that.
I mean, that's really great. I mean, this is why we're doing these discussions, to actually to learn from each other. And there you go. We've made the connections here. Eva, would you like to come in? You had a question.
Yes. First, I would like to say thank you to Maureen, because I learned lots of new things that I will use both as a design educator and a design researcher. And I teach kids at school. They are 14 to 16. So I liked all the examples that you gave us. But the question I wanted to ask is, when is design thinking not the solution? Do you have any experiences of kind of failed tests, trials? And I mean in the educational system, like both students, but also in school.
I think it's hard to answer that, because lots of times, like when I'm brought in to teach design, there's sort of a buy-in that happens already a little bit, right? Because they want to learn design. So there's not that resistance. I think a culture has to be open to learning new ways to do things, that if it's going to really take root. I think the challenge too sometimes is, a lot of times in teacher professional development, you're like, if you go to a writer's workshop, right, you come in, and when you leave that writer's workshop, you have this concrete skill, like, great, I know how to do an author circle, right? I know how to do this. With design, because it's bigger and broader and more about culture change and personal change, if you don't sort of follow up, sometimes the learning sort of sits but doesn't permeate the culture, it doesn't stay. So I think the failure might be if you don't have, because sometimes you do need extended coaching, right? Any good professional development, I think, can't just be a one-off. It has to be, you know, coaching, whether in person or remote, where you follow up when people have questions like, how do you make an empathy map? Or, you know, how do I integrate this into my 4th grade science class or my high school history class? So the failure sometimes is the expectation, maybe, that you think this is going to just be a one-off thing, or maybe the openness of a culture to trying and experimenting, because there's a lot of, you know, I don't know how to do this, right? And we're supposed to be experts as teachers, and we're trying this new thing. So sometimes there's that internal, like, I don't know if I know how to do this, and being, for me, it's an opportunity to model for your students. Great, I'm learning this new thing. We're trying this. This is how you become a lifelong learner. You don't always know how to do things. So that answers the question.
Thank you. And maybe you also need your colleagues on board, so you could partner up with them.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's grassroots. Someone read an article or visited the D-School website. I'm like, oh, great. Sometimes it's the head of school saying, let's do this. There's also, we have that curriculum, Ava, the Red Lab curriculum, which was from the class I told you about, which is you designed for middle schoolers, but lots of teachers have taken it and done different things. And it's kind of a nice model. Even when we're asking Eric about like doing the quick design challenge and then skill building and then doing a longer one, I think it's a grid of like a month long of activities, and it's on the Red Lab website. If you can't find it, you also
I'll look into it.
I'll send it.
Thank you.
Ursula, you had a quick question. Would you like to come in, please?
Okay. Thank you, Eric. And my question is, Maureen, from your perspective, to what extent is it important to develop design abilities as a means of learning other curriculum content, or because they are valuable themselves? Learn design ability for what?
Yeah, I think both, Ursula. I think they're, as standalone, they're important parts of being a learner today. And then I think the teaching part of it is if you can embed them in content learning. So when we teach them in the D-School, we're teaching the design process. We're not necessarily teaching the content, right? We're teaching this is how you become a designer. In classrooms with teachers, they have content to deliver. So the way, if they can find a way to teach those abilities through content, then it becomes meaningful. It doesn't become sort of a standalone. But I think it's that question again, going like, are they mindsets that will help learners thrive in any, as a lifelong learner? Then they are standalone. So I think it's, I don't think there's any one way to do it. I think it's you also having that agency to figure out, okay, here's these abilities, how do they work for me? Just like Brian asking, okay, this is my class, this is what I want to do, how can I make them work for me?
Thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you so much, Maureen, for answering the questions. And I think it was nice to exchange, and yeah, it's understanding a little bit better, different exercises. Hopefully Brian will be able to use some of that in his classes, and hopefully we'll be able to do maybe some workshops, in the future. And it brings me to a next talk that we'll be planning for next month. And the next month we will have looking at. That's why I was asking Brian about the context. The context is. He's our next speaker with Jan from TU Delft and Brian, and their interest is actually looking at visualization and how visualization can be thought of as building a knowledge. And you talk about yourself, Maureen, about the importance of being able to visualize. So this is a follow-up talk next month, and hopefully you'll be able to join us. We have the talks every Tuesday or first month, and we are looking forward to seeing you next month, everybody. Liv, would you like to take us off?
Yes, and then thank you so much, Maureen. It has been wonderful to listen to your presentation. And as Eva said, she has learned a lot of things. I have also. So we take with us some of your ideas, and together with what we have from earlier times, we learn more and more. And we really hope to see you and all the others on the next event, which is May 3rd. Is that correct, Eric? May 3rd? And then
that is
it's
correct,
Brian,
yes.
yeah, and Jan Willem. So looking forward to see you again, and please follow up all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maureen. And welcome to next session. Gracias a todos por haberse unido hoy día.
Oh, did they take us up?
Ok, muchas gracias. Vamos a cerrar la sesión.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Oh, no.